A lot of people talk about the Spotify algorithm, but right now there are more unanswered questions and misunderstandings than ever in the community. And some of those are: how does the Spotify radio really work? Have Discover Weekly and Release Radar streams actually gone down? Did the formula for the popularity index change? Do engagement metrics like streams per listener and save rate matter at all? And lastly, does your music genre and the way you promote it influence your algorithm? So what if the answers to all those questions can only be found in non-publicly available data? As a data scientist, I took a look at a community source dataset, and I'm going to break down the full report so that even if you're not a data scientist, you can understand it and follow along. But before we deep dive into the data, I want to explain how this project came all together. This all has been made possible by Andrew Southworth, and everyone who's watching this video will probably know him. If you haven't heard of Andrew, he is a YouTuber commonly known for his videos on meta ads for musicians and how to grow on Spotify. He has had prominent guests on his channel like Adam Ivy, Tia, and Rick Barker, the former manager of Taylor Swift. He also just started a podcast with Jesse Cannon, Matt Bacon, and Dustin Boyer. I personally watched all of his videos and I definitely recommend to check him out. So what Andrew did is he published a video asking people to participate in the data collection, and he created a Google form where people could submit their data. In the end, 157 artists provided their data directly from Spotify for Artists. So a huge thanks goes out to Andrew, and thanks also to everyone who helped this project by providing their data. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the results. What you see here is the full report, and it's 26 pages. You can download it along with the code and also an anonymized version of the dataset. It's all publicly available and linked below. So like I said, this analysis was conducted by me, but I also had help from another data scientist called Sisha Lu, and she joined the project voluntarily and really did a great job. And also on a side note, there has been a part 1 of the analysis, which I did also with Andrew. You can find it in this link. And Andrew also made a video breaking down the results, which you can find here. Let's have a look at the data collection form. So this is the form where people would manually input their data. And here's the video that Andrew did explaining how to fill out this form. So you would enter your artist name, song name, your genre of the song, the release date of your song, and so on. Then the streams, listeners, and other metrics from Spotify for Artists. Then, and this was very important, artists had to type in their popularity index, which they could see at Spotify for Developers. Then we also included what is the dominant rate this artist has promoted a song, how often do they release, how many songs they have in radio right now, how many songs this artist has ever released, and if they are independent or signed to a label, and if the song is opted into discovery mode. Now something regarding the data quality. Because this was manually input, there were of course mistakes. Since the data was taken from Spotify for Artists, it's just a snapshot at a certain time of the day. So they just have the data for one day and then they update it one day later. And the same goes for the Spotify for Developers, so we have a natural time lag there. This table shows a summary of the variables inside the dataset, and there are a bunch of variables that were provided through the data entry that I just showed you, but we also engineered a bunch of new variables. For example, the number of days since release, and a category for the popularity index, and a second category. Then we also engineered metrics like listeners stream ratio in the past 28 days and the amount of algorithmic streams in the past 28 days. You can go through this on your own, but essentially this table covers all the variables that we created. Now, since the data was collected manually, there were a lot of mistakes for the data entries, and we tried to correct them as good as possible. Mainly we looked for inconsistencies, like when streams in the last 28 days are smaller than listeners in the past 28 days, which can't be true, of course. Also, if the release date has been inputted wrong, We manually corrected the data when it makes sense to us, but if we couldn't make sense of it, we just removed the data points or the data cells. Now let's look at an overview of the dataset. In total, data for 326 songs by 157 artists are included. So you can see that sometimes the data for one song was put in multiple times, which makes sense because at another time point the data could be different, the amount of streams are different, right? Out of those artists, 147 are independent and only 10 are signed to a label. But it's good to see that we also have data from artists that are signed to a label. Now the average numbers of songs that an artist has released in the dataset is 39, which I think is impressive. Having 39 songs released means that you already put in some work. This graphic shows the distribution of the release consistency, and we can see that 30% of the artists here have a release consistency of over 12 weeks. Many have 3 to 4 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, and 7 to 8 weeks, and only 6 artists in the dataset are releasing every 1 to 2 weeks. This pie chart here shows the promotional method that was mainly used, so you could just pick one, and 64% used meta ads, then comes social media, and 10% no promotion, 7% third-party playlisting, 6% Submit Hub, Groova playlist push, etc., and just 1% other sources. This graphic here shows the popularity index by the categories that we derived. So to make it visually more appealing, we created some variables for the popularity index that indicate a class. And here you can see it's 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 13, and so on. And we can see that 77% of the data points had a popularity index of 22 to 25. And we also had a bunch of data points who had basically a popularity score of 0 to 5. But we also had really popular songs with 40 or above. Regarding discovery mode, we asked this in the Google form, but we only included it later after the analysis had already started because frankly we forgot. And so in 1/3 of the whole data set, this information was missing. So for consistency in the analysis, we decided to not include it in the models. Even though we didn't include this variable, I can say that it had a positive impact on the amount of radio streams, which we are going to discuss some more later. In the community, it is said that streams for Release Radar and Discover Weekly have been gone down, and that radio is the most dominant playlist right now. In this chapter, we are going to see if that is actually true. So here in this table, you can see data from the Release Radar. And not only for this dataset, but also for the old dataset that we did in part 1. On the left, you can see the popularity index category. So we have 0 to 5, 6 to 10, and so on. So let's see. Let's take a look at 16 to 20. The amount of data points in this class was 36. And you can see that the amount of data points is kind of even distributed. That's why we picked those classes. In this data set, in average, and this means the Release Radar streams in the past 28 days, and we just did a mean, an average of that, is 217.5, ranging from 0 to 1,600. These are the observations in the old datasets for this exact same class, and this is the average of Release Radar streams from the old dataset, so it seems to be more here. If we have a look at 21 to 25, we can in average expect 322 streams. In the old dataset, it was way more, it was 1,500. In the category 26 to 30, we can now expect 700, and before it was 2,450. So let me note that the sample sizes here are not that large, but still there's a clear tendency that now the amount of Release Radar streams is far less than before. I'm an artist myself and I release music, and if I imagine I bring my song to 21 to 25, which takes quite a few streams to obtain through promotional methods, and I get 322 streams, that's not really a lot, in my opinion. Now let's have a look at Discover Weekly. And unfortunately, in the old analysis, we also started quite late to discover Discover Weekly streams, and the sample sizes were so low that I really couldn't include it in the comparison here. We have the popularity index category again, and N marks the amount of data points in the category, and we can see that up to 16 to 20 we don't experience any Discover Weekly streams. For 21 to 25 there are some, but I think that could be like a data error. But I've seen also reports or heard reports that people are getting a Discover Weekly bump with a popularity score lower than 25. But this is usually not the case. But here you can see that from 26 to 30, the Discover Weekly streams are beginning. And this was the same in the old analysis. Roughly, you have to obtain a popularity score of 30 or higher to get Discover Weekly exposure. Then for 31 to 40 and 41 or above, you can see that there are Discover Weekly streams. In my personal opinion, those amount of streams in average are not really that high. You can also see that it's not a guarantee to get this popularity score and then get Discover Weekly exposure. There are a lot of data points with just 0 Discover Weekly streams, and the maximum ranges are quite high. Now we're getting to the good stuff and are able to actually look at some radio data. So essentially this is the same table structure. So let's take a look at the 26 to 30 class. There are 76 data points here. If we score that popularity for the 28 days, we can expect an average a radio exposure of 1,980 streams. And if we have a look at the same class on Discover Weekly and Release Radar, for Discover Weekly it's around 600, and for Release Radar it's 700. So radio would be more than the Release Radar and Discover Weekly combined here. And you can take a look and compare those other classes of popularity, and we can see that radio is really the dominant playlist right now. And now it's just not a theory or a rumor, we can actually have a look at the data and say that this is true. Now this table lists the mean, min and max values for the radio 28 days, but also for the radio 7 days. And this variable, radio 7 days, we are going to predict with a statistical model later, so stay around for that. Now this table is really interesting. What we did, we calculated the algorithmic streams by adding up Discover Weekly, Release Radar and radio, and we also calculated the non-algorithmic streams by taking the total number of streams and subtracting the algorithmic streams. Now this table is really interesting because it shows the amount of streams that are algorithmic and non-algorithmic for different popularity categories. Let's take 11 to 15. For all the data points that were in the class 11 to 15, we can see here that the percentage of algorithmic streams was 25% and 75% were non-algorithmic, which means the vast majority. If we pick a higher popularity index category, we can see that the amount or percentage of algorithmic streams actually increases. You can see that for 21 to 25 it's around 28%, and it reaches around 40% in the class 31 to 40. So what is the conclusion here? If you have a look at these percentages, we can see that you have to account as an artist for the vast majority of streams. Even if we add Discover Weekly, Release Radar and radio together, if we want to maintain the popularity index of our song, and let's say our song has 25, so that in the following weeks or months it doesn't decrease, we have to see that the non-algorithmic percentage of our streams is still pretty high in average, which means we have to get streams from outside sources, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And it also means even if your song is fairly popular, and I would say 31 to 40 is pretty popular, you still have to have an average a 60% of non-algorithmic streams. We're going to talk about this more later, and also in the context of engagement metrics like saves, playlist ads, and streams per listener. If you have gained any value from this video so far, I want to please consider subscribing to this channel. There are a lot more videos coming out that revolve around the topic of data analysis on Spotify data. And if you have any questions regarding the report, just drop them below and I will try to answer everyone. What you're seeing here is the old report from 2022. We calculated the amount of streams and listeners that you would need to achieve a certain popularity score. And if you have a look here for 20 to 22, we needed around 1,000 listeners in the past 28 days and around 2,500 streams for that. 30 to 32, we needed 4,000 listeners and around 9,000 streams in the past 28 days. Now, has the formula changed for the popularity index? We are going to find out right now, because I listed here the average streams and listeners the data entries had for a certain popularity index category. If you take a look here for 11 to 13, we can see that in average there were 530 listeners in the past 28 days and 1,500 streams. Now here I listed the old results just right beneath the new results. So the last 3 columns on the right are from the old report. And we can see here that for a similar category, and here it was 20 to 21, and the old categories was 20 to 22, but it's roughly the same. Look at how many listeners and streams we need now. So for 20 to 22 in average, it's 2,100 listeners, which is roughly double the amount of listeners that we need for the same popularity index. And if we have a look at 30 to 32, it's now 7,000 listeners instead of 4,000 and 30,000 streams instead of 9,000. And for 40, it has almost tripled from 13,000 listeners to 33,000 listeners. And also the amount of streams has gone up. So apparently they did change the formula, and we are going to see later in the modeling part of this analysis what the new formula is. And a personal view from me as an artist, if I want to achieve 20 to 21, I would have to acquire 2,000 listeners, which is quite a bunch. You have to do quite some promotion to achieve that. Now we get to the statistical modeling for the popularity index. This is a really exciting chapter because we did this before with another model. And this time we used a more simple model, which is a linear model. This graphic here shows on the x-axis listeners in the past 28 days, and on the y-axis the popularity index. You can clearly see that there's a high correlation and relation between those two variables, and it seems to be a logarithmic relation. For the model of the popularity index, I have to say that we tried out possibly all the variables in the dataset, also the engineered ones. We tried to include engagement metrics and timely metrics. But in the end, what we found out is that the best performing model on the popularity index is actually one of the simplest ones. This is with the equation number 1, which is essentially, and don't be scared by the mathematics, y is the popularity index and x1 is the listeners in the last 28 days. So essentially this is a fairly easy model. Now, how well did this model perform? We applied it to the dataset of 508 data points, and we yielded a R-square of 0.91. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, this metric is between 0 and 1, and in really simple terms, 1 is perfect and 0 is like the worst case. 91% is pretty good, but for a practical sort of view, we use the mean AD, which is the mean absolute deviation, which essentially means if we take the predictions from the model for the popularity score and we subtract the predicted value from the true value, we get a difference. And if we take the absolute of those differences, we get a mean of 2.48. And this essentially means if you're going to predict the popularity score, just taking in the listeners in the past 28 days, we are only in average about 2.4 points wrong. And if we go back to the old analysis where we also did a model, we used a more complex model called XGBoost, but the model performance here was 1.5, which is essentially better by 1 point. And you can see here in this graphic shows the true popularity scores of the songs along with the predictions. We're going to take a look at the same graphic here. So on the x-axis are the data points and they are ordered by the popularity index. So on the left there are the data points with a low popularity index. On the right side are those with a high popularity index. In blue you can see the true values, and in red you can see the predictions of our model. Now you can see that our model fits the curve quite well. Of course, if we take a look at the left, we can see that the model actually predicts negative values, which should not be the case, but we didn't use a restricted model that prevents the prediction of negative values. I manually put those to 0, and then we even have an improved mean AD of 2.28. Of course, this model could be improved, and I suggested a nonlinear model with constraints, but you could also use and try out all kinds of machine learning models. Here one can notice that for a few data points the prediction is not really that good, and the true points are not on the curve. And I suspect that those are the ones that were opted into discovery mode. As I mentioned, we didn't use the discovery mode variable because there were many data points missing. And for a linear model, all these data points would have been removed. That's why we didn't include it. But I guess what we could do is create a new graphic where those points are marked that have the discovery mode enabled. So that would be interesting. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. Now, to finish off this chapter, I want to ask the question if we can actually achieve a perfect model here and a mean AD of 0. And I'm arguing here that we can't do that with community sourced data because the data is essentially a snapshot on one particular time of the date for Spotify for artists. And then Spotify for developers gives us the popularity index also at one specific time point of the day. So there's always a time lag between the data points. And if you gain a few hundred streams or listeners overnight, this will probably not be reflected in the data that we are collecting. So we are assuming that there's a formula for the popularity index that Spotify has with some constant. But if we are observing this from the outside and just collecting data that is lagged, we will never have a perfect model. But to be honest, this is really close enough, and using the results from the table here, you can actually get a good estimate on how many listeners you need to achieve a certain popularity score. And then you also know how many algorithmic streams you can expect. Now we are finally investigating radio, and specifically radio in the past 7 days. Now, a lot of people have said that they see a radio push in the first 4 or 5 weeks of release, and then it drops down to almost 0. And others have told me that 6 months after the song has been released, all of a sudden they get radio spikes. And I even heard instances of artists where after 2 years the radio started to work. So essentially no one really seems to know how it works. Now we're going to have a look if the time actually influences the amount of streams that you get from radio and if there's some kind of relationship. Let's go back to the radio table. Here it is. So if we take a look at the radio 7 min and max values, we can see that of course the minimum is 0 and it's almost for all the classes 0 or close to 0, but the maximum amount of streams for 7 days, in one case it was 150,000. For the category 31 to 40 it was 8,000. So it wouldn't make sense to just show the radio 7 streams in one graphic, because we would essentially see nothing for the lower popularity scores. To visually plot the radio streams in one graphic, we created a new variable called relative radio streams 7 days. Let me explain how this new variable was constructed. So for example, a song has the popularity index of 22. Then we take the radio streams in the past 7 days and divide it by the average of all the radio streams in the past 7 days for all the data points that have also a popularity score of 22. So essentially we take an average per popularity score to get a feeling of how many streams are normal for this popularity score. Then for a data point we divide the relative radio stream 7 days by this mean number. If we have a value of 1, that means that the data point is just performing averagely. And if we have a value of 0, it just means that there are 0 radio streams. And if the value is above 1, it means that the song is over average performing. Let me explain what we are seeing here in this graphic. On the x-axis, there's the amount of weeks that have passed since release. Between 0 and 100, that means roughly the week of release until 2 years after. On the y-axis are the relative radio streams in the past 7 days, which I just explained. And the color is the popularity index. So bluish means very low popularity index, red means pretty high popularity index. If we have a look at the 0 line here on the y-axis, we can see that no matter how many time has passed after release, we definitely have data points in the data set that acquired 0 streams. And if we take a look at the line at 1, we can see that there are also a lot of data points in all the time frames that have average streams, and also a lot of points over 1 for the whole time interval. In the first 5 to 10 weeks or 0 to 10 weeks, it seems that a lot of the points are performing over average. Even though this graphic visualizes all the data points on one scale, and we can see if the data points are performing over average or under average for their popularity score, we have to take a different graphic to see if the time actually matters on the exposure. So for the next graphic, we categorized the weeks that have passed since release, 0 to 5 weeks, 5 to 10, 10 to 25 weeks, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, and then also 100 to 1000. We had data points that are far older. And the boxes that you're seeing, they are called box plots, and essentially they are showing the distribution for data points. You don't need to worry about that. What's important right here is the middle line of the boxes, which indicates the median of the relative radio streams in the past 7 days for the group of weeks since release. Okay, let's break this down. So this sounds quite complicated, but let's just have a look at the first box, which has a median here of around 0.7. That means that for all the data points that are in the 0 to 5 week interval, we have a median performance of relative radio streams in the past 7 days of 0.7. If we compare those groups, we can see that the second group here has a median of around 0.3, which means that many of the points are underperforming for their popularity index. So the people that have reported that after 5 weeks of release, the radio streams are decreasing and dribbling down to almost 0, they are right. The data shows here that the median is definitely lower in the 5 to 10 compared to the 0 to 5. But when we take a look at the consecutive boxes, we can see that the average performance here increases after that. Compared to the performance in the first 5 weeks, it's not particularly higher or lower. In practice, that means that even a few weeks or even years after the release of the song, the radio exposure could be quite high. The common belief in the community seems to be that the radio is kind of the new release radar and gives you a boost in the first few weeks of release and then dribbles off. And that seems to be true, but here we can also see that even a few weeks or even years after, we can still get a good amount of radio exposure. But at the same time, we also observe that there are a lot of songs and data points that have almost no radio exposure, and there are a few outliers that perform incredibly well. In the next chapter, we're going to find out how good we can predict the radio streams and what metrics actually do influence the amount of radio exposure. Nobody really seems to know how radio really works, and we are finally going to have a look at the modeling of the radio, and we're going to find out which metrics do influence the radio and which metrics don't. So we tried to predict or explain the radio streams in the past 7 days, and we tried possibly all the variables in the data set in the model, and we tried the genre, the promotion way, time-related variables like days since release, the release consistency, if the artist is independent or signed to a label, and so on. What we did find out was that the discovery mode was significant, but as I already explained, we didn't include it in the model because we had to remove around 1/3 of the data for that, at least for the linear model. And then there are other variables like streams in the past 7 days or listeners and even save rate. The problem with those is that the radio streams last 7 days is directly related because the radio streams are part of the total streams. So if we would use, let's say, the streams in the past 7 days, then the model would be almost perfect, and this is something that we just can't do in data science. This equation here that you can see, equation number 2, yielded the best result. Y is the radio streams past 7 days, and we had to logarithmically transform the target variable. And on the right side, you can only see one variable, which is x1, and that is the popularity index. Now you're probably wondering, okay, why aren't there any other variables in the model? And it actually turned out that all these variables that I listed, days since release, the genre, independency or label, it really didn't show any benefit to the model. It didn't make the model any better, and that was really a surprise. We also tried out engagement metrics like streams per listener ratio. We constructed also, and you can have a look at the table that I showed on the beginning, which shows all the variables. We tried to construct a various amount of variables that reflect the engagement, but all those variables, they didn't make the model better. And this really simple model performed the best, and that is really crazy to me. So let's have a look at the model performance. So we have the R-square, which is 74%, and essentially means that the model explains 74% of the logarithmically transformed target variable. It explains the variance of this here on the left side. And this is not quite easy to do because the radio streams vary a lot depending on which popularity index the song has. So the first thing that we did, we calculated the mean absolute deviation as before, which is just if we subtract the prediction from the true value, take the absolute value, so minus is plus, and then take a mean and average, we get 989, which means that we are on average 989 streams wrong with the model prediction. So being wrong 989 streams sounds really bad at first glimpse, but it really depends, and this is also the problem, because when we achieve 2000 streams and the model predicts 1000, we are 1000 streams wrong. That's not really great. But if we have 200,000 streams and the model predicts 199,000, then the model is pretty good. So that is not really a good metric to evaluate the model's performance. So the next thing that we did was to take the MAD, which is the median absolute deviation. And the median absolute deviation is practically you take all the absolute deviation, which is the prediction minus the true value. You take the absolute, and then you order them. And after you order them, you take the value that is right in the middle, the median, and that is pretty robust to outliers. And we can see here that the median absolute deviation is just 117, which means if we order all the absolute deviations, the value in the middle is just 117. But then again, the interpretation of this metric is kind of difficult. So what we came up with is a heuristic measure, and we called it the mean relative deviation, MRD. We take the absolute deviation and divide it by the true value plus a constant z. And essentially, and I really don't have to go into this too deeply, but the purpose of that is to account that streams that are low on data points that get a low amount of streams doesn't get rated so hard. So let me show you a few examples what this metric turns out to be. Let me emphasize that if this metric is 0, the model is perfect, and if it's high, then yeah, it's not really good. If our true value is 20 streams and our predicted value is 40, then our MRD is 0.28. If we have 200 streams and 400 predicted, then it's 0.8. It gets worse. If the true value is 2000 and the predicted value is 1800, the MRD is 0.1. And let's say it's 1000 to 1500, it's at 0.47. Our model achieved a MRD of 0.73, which can be interpreted that the model predictions are on average around 73% of the true value. I just took out the good old calculator to make some examples. So let's say our model predicts with our popularity score 2000 streams. And what this MRD says is that our true value can deviate 73% of this predicted value. So 2000 times 1.73 is 3460 streams if we have the low boundary times 0. And this is just 1 minus 0.73, we get 540. So how does this look visually? To actually show this in a graph, we divided the data into 3 groups. The first one has a popularity index smaller than 25, the next one between 25 and 40, and the last one greater than 40. We did this so that we can actually show the observations in one graph, and it makes sense and you can actually see something. So the first graph that we are going to look at is for the first group with popularity index smaller than 25. Again, on the x-axis we have the data points essentially ordered by the popularity index. So on the left it's the really low popularity indexes like 0, and on the right side it's getting to 25. On the y-axis we have the radio streams last 7 days, and we have inserted 2 points. The blue one is the true value, so it's the observed radio streams last 7 days in the dataset, and the red one is the prediction of our model. Now let me zoom in here a little bit. As you can see, the predictions, they do follow a staircase function, which makes sense. Our model only takes in the popularity index. On a quick side note, it takes it in on a logarithmic and on a linear scale, and we only had whole numbers in the dataset, means we didn't have 19.5, we just had 19 or 20. So the staircase function here makes perfect sense. And we can see that the deviation from the predicted value is pretty high. There are a lot of points or a lot of songs that get 0 streams and a lot of points that are quite performing highly. But at the same time, we can also see that the main tendency is matched quite nicely by our model. Popularity index increases and the average amount of radio streams increases too. So how does it look for the middle group with a popularity index between 25 and 40? So this graph gets just extended to the right, And here we can even see the staircase function more clearly. There are a lot of data points that get 0 streams, and at the same time there are quite a few who are high performing. And if we take a look at the scale, here it says 8,000, and on the other graphic for the lower group it's 2,000. So it seems that the maximum values for the radio streams, they are kind of limited by the popularity index. And when I say that, please also note that of course the radio streams do influence the popularity score, because if you get a huge boost on radio, your popularity score which will increase. Now the last group are those data points that have a popularity index of greater than 40. Here we can see that there are some data points that have, and let me zoom in here, that have almost 0 streams, but most of them have at least some streams. It's hard to see here with the scaling of the graphic, but they have some radio exposure. As the popularity goes up, we can also see that the true value of radio streams goes up, and this is almost looks like a perfect linear function here, or logarithmic function. And we can see that our model matches the tendency quite nicely. And here on this data point we can see that the true value of streams is pretty high compared to the fitted streams. And we can see here again that it's a staircase function of the popularity index. I guess if we had a few thousand data points on each popularity index, this model would perform better. But still there's a lot of variance in the data that is unaccounted for. I just went back here for a second to have a look at the radio streams table once again. And we can see that, and this is interesting, the maximum values, they really increase if we have a look at the popularity index category. So it seems that the higher your popularity index gets, the higher your possible amount of radio streams will get. And there's no exceptions here, it's just the max value per class is increasing all the time. If your song is here in the category 16 to 20, then we would say, looking at the data, okay, the maximum amount of radio streams should be around 1,390. But it could also be that if the song gets a huge radio bump, let's say 20,000, then it gets catapulted within a few days in this class. So I just want to say that those maximum and minimum values, they are not quite completely accurate. They are also just tendencies. And since we don't have real-time data, it's impossible to say what the real limits are here. So in conclusion, we can say that the model is capturing the tendency of the radio, but it's far from perfect. And after having tried out all the configurations with the variables in the dataset, I'm pretty confident to say that the information that we need to make this model even better, it's not in the data that is available on Spotify for Artists. So we're going to talk about that more in the next chapter. So overall, I'm quite happy with the results. Even though the model is not perfect or far from perfect, if we have our popularity score, we can predict roughly how many radio streams we are getting. And we can also take a look at those minimum and maximum values and the average values to see if our song is underperforming regarding to the radios or overperforming. So for me personally, as an artist, this information is highly valuable, and it could be the same for you too, because let's say I do a promotion campaign and bring my song to 28, then I know I can in average expect 2,000 streams from radio, and if that's a lot or not, that's up to you to say. I know that if my song is going well, I can expect a lot more streams, but I'm also sure that if I get just 200 streams, for example, like here, I'm not too disappointed. But at the same time, I also know that I could almost get 0 streams if the song is not performing well due to some metrics that we are going to talk about next. Now I want to give you my take on what I think, what data we have been missing. Also, I want to talk about part 3 of this analysis, which we plan in the future, and how you can participate in it. And make sure that you stay around until the end, because I want to explain my take on what we should make out of all this information that we learned today. In terms of the data that we have been missing, I am just drafting an example here of an artist called Z. The Z radio streams are dependent on a few factors. Here is what they are, in my opinion. So what we have learned, the popularity index influences the radio streams, but also how many people generally listen on Spotify during that time period. And by that I mean also in different countries. Then on which and how many song, album or artist radios is our artist Z generally playing or ranked. And what do I mean by that? I believe that for each song, album and artist, Spotify has a list of other songs and artists that are ranked to be played on the radio for that. And I believe that once an artist or song gets higher on the ranking, then it gets played more on the radio. If we believe that is true, how many people are listening to the songs, albums or artists on which Z is ranked during that time period? So it hugely depends. Let's say even you are ranked on another artist's radio, it really depends how many people are listening to this artist at that time. If you think about that, it makes perfect sense that our model can't explain the whole data. I believe even if we had additional information, we could never really predict the radio performance fully. Because to the radio streams there is just so much natural variability. Then lastly, I believe a huge factor is also if you're ranked on another artist or Z is ranked on another artist, it really matters how frequently that artist is putting out new releases. That artist told me that when another artist that he is on his radio dropped a new EP, then the artist's radio streams saw a huge increase. And that makes perfect sense because when this other artist dropped a new EP, of course many people were listening to it, and then automatically my friend gets also more streams. And I think that it really matters, and this is one of the takeaway, that our association on Spotify is really on point. Which means if you are looking at your own radio or the radio that your friends are seeing when they click on your radio, you know that it's personalized. It really matters how closely the radio is matching. And if your radio doesn't make any sense, I wouldn't be wondered that your radio performance is not that great. And the other way around is that when your algorithmic association doesn't make any sense, then people who get suggested your song will likely skip it, and then you will not get any streams at all. That's at least my theory. So I'm already thinking about part 3 of the analysis, and what I think that we should include there is the number of collaborations that an artist has done, because I think that's really important on the radio exposure. And then some scales on how well you think your artist's radio matches your genre. A scale on where you think your fans also like matches your genre. Because I firmly believe that those variables have an influence. And I think that we are going to do it a little bit different because right now in part 1 and 2, we had mostly only 1 or 2 data points for each artist and song. That means we only have one snapshot in time for the song's data. And I believe that if we had the data for each day for a specific song, we could see more patterns for the algorithmic exposure, and it would yield a huge benefit. We're going to do part 3 a little bit differently. One possible way for part 3 to collect the data would be that the participants give us access to their Spotify for Artists, and then we can automatically scrape the data. So if you want to participate in part 3 of this analysis, make sure to contact Andrew or myself, and the contact info is linked below in this video, but it's also on this report you can find here. But what do we actually make out of all this information that we learned today? If we are going to promote a new song, we know that with this table here, how many listeners we have to get to obtain a certain popularity score. And if we know which popularity score we are going to achieve with our promotional method and with our budget, we can actually also know how much release radar streams, Discover Weekly we can expect, and also how many streams on the radio. And we can even take this information into account when we calculate our budget for the song promotion. I know I talked about engagement metrics and that they did not matter in the modeling of the popularity score and for the radio. but let me tell you that they still matter. And the reason is this table. We have seen that for all the popularity index categories, we still need to achieve roughly between 60% and 80% of the streams on our own, which essentially means your streams per listener rate is still important, because if your streams per listener ratio is high, it means that people are re-listening to your song, which helps maintaining your popularity score, which then helps to maintain your algorithmic exposure. And this table also tells us that we have to bring in people from other sources like social media, the email list, and even from collaborations with other artists that I think can improve the radio performance. I also firmly believe that these results are beneficial for our mindset, because when we know the average amount of streams and the min and max value that we can expect, and I certainly think that knowing all this information can help us manage our expectations, how we're going to think that our song will perform. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, Andrew has made a video on this report too, and I recommend to watch that next. Also, we are doing part 3 of the analysis soon. So if you want to participate in the data collection and help out, just contact me on Instagram or contact Andrew.